Lecture number 8, Doing Inequality. Symbolic interactionists are concerned with the same issues that all sociologists are. Why some people in the world get more power and money than others. Interactionists do look at issues of race and gender, but they will include all sorts of ways that individuals interact in a way that some people leave that interaction getting what they want more so than other people. Race and gender are part of the story, but so is how good-looking you are, the resources you bring to a situation, and the words that you use. In short, life is unfair, and more so for some people than others. We will unpack these processes, but please note that race and gender will get most of the attention. Status everywhere. There is a long history of research on groups in sociology and psychology. One thing has been clear after decades of research. Hierarchies happen. Take a bunch of strangers together, and within minutes a hierarchy develops with higher status people having a greater impact on what happens in the group than lower status people. How might you know if someone has more status? Think about this when you're at the next party or a group of strangers form. Look at who gets the most attention and most people listen to. Who has the most influence in the group? Perhaps the person whose opinion is listened to the most or gets to choose what to watch. What might be going on that some people get more status than others? Look at the characteristics of the person talking. See how they dress and how they look. With enough time, you can start seeing the things that someone possesses that have more or less value in our culture, and people with more of those things will receive more status in groups. In the case of Doc and the boys, as diagrammed here, William Foote White noticed that Doc was not necessarily the best bowler in the crowd, statistically anyway, but as the diagram shows, he was one of the top players. White believed that Doc's relative status in the group helped. He observed a series of small things that may have helped make the difference in the outcomes. In this case, for instance, more people would cheer for Doc than lower status members, and lower status members were jeered more often. These subtle things, he theorized, may have made enough difference to put Doc closer to the top and others closer to the bottom. Did these guys know what they were doing? Maybe, maybe not. Regardless, this process helped Doc stay in his relative leadership position because winning these types of events help people to see how the status hierarchy is justified in one way or another. It's kind of like a cycle in which leaders get to keep their position in the group. The same holds true for those people on the bottom. They're expected to do less well, and their poor performances help the group to justify their lower positions. Intersections of roles and power. Social exchange theory generally proposes that people who contribute more to a group get more status from it. The idea is that we generally expect reciprocity. How does it feel when you put a lot of work into a project, but some people get the same credit? Most of us feel bad, and a bit cheated, really. What happens to the students in the groups who contributes the most? They usually are the ones that talk the most, because other people won't, and literally do most of the work, writing and editing the paper before turning it in. Sometimes we give those people the title of leader, other times we simply assume the role for them. However it turns out, research generally supports the idea that leadership status comes from exchange processes. People who give more to a group generally receive higher status and higher standing than people who contribute less. They are exchanging service for status. What good does this leadership do for a person after all? It would seem to be a matter of frustration, but people get a lot from it. They are the ones that tend to get positive feedback from a professor, which is important when people look for reference letters. We may not get positive feedback from our accomplishments in a group activity like this, but it is great training for management positions and doing graduate level work, which is often thankless work. These dynamics are well researched, but it also is important to note that status hierarchies like these are influenced by our position in society prior to entering the group. Each time we interact with people, we bring our relative attractiveness, our class background, our race, our gender, and other things. We also bring more or less needed skills. Some of this is situational. Who would you want to help you on the side of a road with a broken down car? A medical doctor with relatively high status, or a mechanic? Though doctors do have higher status and they make more money, a mechanic is going to be much more useful in this situation. Expectation states theory, or sometimes called status characteristics theory, encapsulates the processes that include both exchange principles of status formation, as well as how our statuses from society impact those exchange processes. The most common finding is that, for example, women need to work harder to get status in groups than men. Women who contribute more to groups do get higher status than men and women who do less, but men have an easier time of it. Why might this be the case, do you think? One last point. Status has its privileges. Research generally shows that people who have status, however they get it, are liked more than low-status people. Even low-status people honor higher-status people more than other lower-status people. Doing inequality. Doing gender has a long history in the field of sociology. The idea is that men and women acting out the roles in society perpetuate inequality. Do you see how this is associated with the concept of dramaturgy or impression management? It is about acting out our part in society. Today, women still make less money than men, even in the same positions. The differences are greater by position. For instance, teachers are generally women, and they make less money than engineers, who are primarily men. But even female lawyers make about 90 or 95% of what male lawyers make. How might acting more like a man or woman perpetuate these income differences? There's no real scientific answer to this question, but it is generally believed that men generate expectations of a higher income than women, and their mannerisms open more leadership positions, hence making more money and gaining more prestige. The idea of doing gender can be applied to any kind of inequality, including race or class. Who is more likely to be more assertive on the job interview, a poor person or a rich person? Knowing that people with more money have more education and experience in these types of interactions. Higher status tends to produce higher status, and much of it has to do with expectations. The point is that dramaturgy helps us to understand that groups we come from impact our people's perceptions of us. They have real consequences for the levels of income and power we have in the world. We could argue that the reason people participate in impression management is to enable them to get things out of interactions. While the purpose of it is not necessarily clear, our self-presentations do make a difference in our positions in the world. Here's the tip. Prepare for your next job interview. Know what you're going to wear and examine your mannerisms. Practice them. It will make a big difference on how people perceive you and your ability to do the job. Pride and prejudice. At this point, you may be able to leave this discussion saying, well, the people who work the hardest get the most status, and that makes sense. Then we brought in the role of characteristics that influence whether people are perceived as higher status or not. This part is a bit more unfair. After all, we can't control how we look. There is another side to the issue of social psychology and inequality. That concept is called prejudice. Why is it that we develop negative bias toward people in some groups and not others? In sociology, there are many theories, but we will focus on things from social psychology. First, there are attitudes that may simply reflect socialization processes. At a young age, we may grow up in a family or culture that espouses negative attitudes toward a particular group. In the U.S., it may be African Americans and whites. In Rwanda, it was Hutus and Tutsis. When I spent time in Haiti, I was told of a great divide between the Haitians and the peoples of the Dominican Republic. It seems like whenever two groups come together, friction, not peace, is the first reaction. Why? Basic group dynamics may be at work here. If you don't know it, there is a tendency to look more favorably on the behaviors of our own groups than others, and to downplay negative behaviors of our own groups and its group members. Do you understand the power of that? It means that when someone in our own group does something good, we tend to attribute it to the group status. For instance, after a touchdown, you might say, "The Chiefs are the best." When someone makes a mistake in our own group, we tend to attribute it to luck or the fault of another group. For instance, blaming referees for being biased when a play has been called a penalty or a foul. Just like we set up groups to maintain power of individuals in a group, we set up groups to keep the relative status in society. Some societies have more formalized class structures than others, such as being very poor, working class, middle classes, and upper classes. Every known society has some class structure with groups in some kind of category like that. Whether it's formalized or not, people know where they are in these classes and where other people fit in that class system, and it's perpetuated over time. Finally, these dynamics help us feel good about discrimination. If you're a Republican, how do you feel about Democratic leaders like Joe Biden? If you're a Democrat, what do you think of Donald Trump? People in each group can conjure objective reasons that the other group is bad or even evil. But these thoughts and feelings can also be explained as an outgrowth of basic individual and group dynamics that work equally well in children's playgrounds as they do in national politics. Affect control theory. Finally, affect control theory extends expectation states theory to say that we also give emotional or affective judgment of people in addition to intellectual ones. Specifically, this includes a judgment of how good or bad people are, how active they are, and how powerful we believe they are, or what is called potency. We do this with both individuals as well as roles and statuses and groups in society. Think about different people you meet over time. Do it now. Write down their names. Next to their names, write down your evaluation of them using these three categories. Good or bad is pretty easy to assess. Activity is a little more challenging, but think an active person is always on the move, working on many different activities, projects, and hobbies. They're always going. Powerful may be more or less easy for you to assess, but a powerful person comes off as confident, and they typically come off as strong and secure. They can be physically powerful, or they may be the type of person that people listen to. Alternatively, someone who ranks low on this characteristic is typically considered meek in some way. Affect control theory, or ACT, originally came from psychology, but it has grown in popularity among sociologists, as sociologists study the ways that people evaluate people both positively and negatively. One final thought. Who do you think ultimately gets the highest status in society? Someone who ranks positively on all three of these characteristics, or someone who ranks low on all three? Consider the figures you have admired the most in the world. How would you rank them on each one of these characteristics? Conclusions. How does knowing something about status processes help us in any way? First, consider each time you interact with people in the future. How might status organizing processes come into play? If your goal is to run an organization, what might you be able to do to increase your chances of obtaining that responsibility? Alternatively, if you're always the one to lead a group and want a break, what might you have to sacrifice in order to get lower status? If our judgments of people from different groups in society are a natural outgrowth of group dynamics, in groups and out groups, it seems like we will be condemned to judgment and feuding forever. That is a possibility. Alternatively, we can use this understanding to help us manage natural emotions that come from these processes and encourage other people to avoid these tendencies. Emotions and judgments are not always wrong. Personally, I think it is good to judge a group of Nazi sympathizers as bad. But those groups represent less than 1% of the population. Short of that, knowing where our emotions are coming from may help us to make more level-headed judgments in otherwise stressful situations.